It's a great pleasure and privilege to honor and celebrate Arvind as friend, collaborator, colleague, and scientist. And I'm most grateful to the organizers of this festival for the opportunity to do so. And my remarks will be more reminiscence and encomium than a disquisition on locality, as opposed to what my title might suggest. Since the themes are, let us say, broadly philosophical, I will adopt the standard philosopher's style of reading my remarks. So here we go. I first met Aravind, as apparently numbers of others have, in California at a workshop on criteria of adequacy for a theory of language at Stanford University in January. I'm sorry?
You want to show what you're reading?
It's handwritten. Yeah, I don't have any tech. I'm sorry. No, I can't. Well, we can get rid of that, though, and put on some. Let's get Ganesh back, right? I think that, or some other contemplative thing. Anyway, I wouldn't even know how. Can we put Ganesh back up as a better background? I don't know how to do it. I wouldn't know how. But anyway. But I don't have anything available to. I have no show and tell. I have a little show. It's hidden. It's hidden. Okay. That's okay. Oh, good. No good. What can I tell you? Okay. So as I was saying. So I went to this conference, workshop on a criteria of adequacy for a theory of language. As others have said, this was a popular topic back when. And I was rather an outsider at this event, having done no work whatsoever in the field. I'd been invited to comment on a paper on the simplicity of phonological rules, which involved philosophical reflections on Chomsky and Hawley's magnum opus, The Sound Pattern of English, and struggle as I did over the course of some months to understand the issues in detail, I was painfully aware that at the end there was little light I could cast on any discussion at all. So desperately wanting to contribute usefully to the workshop, I carefully read what other papers were available, and as luck would have it, I discovered several papers on formal aspects of language acquisition. I'd studied recursion theory as a graduate student, and this topic at least seemed to offer the prospect that I might be able to contribute to something, right? So I wrote a brief note on grammatical induction, which I thought might be of interest, and presented it at the workshop. And as even better luck would have it, Arvind was in the audience and kindly introduced himself afterwards and generously and kindly expressed interest in the perspective on language learning I described. And he also suggested that we get together back in Philly. And I have to say, this workshop and in particular my encounter with Arvind was really a turning point in my life. It actually, in many ways, transformed my life. And I'd been at Penn since the fall of 1979, but I hadn't met Arvind. My work was in then obscure area of logic and the foundations of mathematics, the application of Kripke models to formal systems of intuitionistic real analysis. And I hadn't strayed far from preoccupation with issues in logic and foundations. And this was about to change. Not long after we returned to Philadelphia from the workshop, Arvind got in touch. At the time, he was collaborating with a young philosopher of science, Steve Kuhn, on the role of entity-centered sentence representation in natural language inferencing. The abstract of their 1979 paper on this topic gives a good description of the goals of the project. We will briefly describe the role of entity-centered structure, ECS, of sentences in natural language inferencing. The basic structure of sentences in discourse generally singles out an entity to be called center among all those which are the arguments of the main predicate, ECS makes n-ary predicates look like monadic by temporarily masking their structure, thereby affecting the relative ease with which certain inferences are made and information is retrieved. Here, in brief, we see what I think of as some of the critical insights that Aravind brought to bear in his work on discourse structure and processing. And first and foremost, that one might actually have a theory of discourse processing, and that such a theory would require special mathematical tools of analysis. This was already a total eye-opener for me. I had been schooled in a tradition in analytic philosophy, which relegated discourse phenomena of the sort that Aravind and Steve were investigating to the grab bag of pragmatic phenomena, right? Which, as opposed to syntax and semantics, were likely beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. I was simultaneously excited by and wary of imagining that one might usefully undertake a rigorous analysis of some such phenomena. But the thing that to a large extent mitigated my wariness was how struck I was by the central idea around which their proposed analysis revolved, namely construing utterances in discourse as having essentially the structure of sentences in monadic predicate logic. As a graduate student, I closely studied various aspects of this logic with one of my mentors, Les Tharp, and I saw immediately how attractive this novel approach could be. From the point of view of the logical tradition, monadic predicate calculus was the first fragment of first-order logic for which Hilbert's and Scheidung's problem was resolved, and indeed long before that problem was articulated by Hilbert. That is, there is a decision procedure for validity of formulas in first-order logic whose vocabulary is restricted to monadic predicate letters. Indeed, this is even the case for sentences of fully monadic second-order logic, a result established by, of all people, Leopold Lervenheim as early as 1915. Thus, from the point of view of pursuing an algorithmic approach to discourse inferencing, the choice of monadic predicate logic as a language for representing the logical form of utterances seemed apt. But by the late 1970s, of course, many fragments of the predicate calculus had been shown to be decidable, so this clear, necessary algorithmic condition on the choice of representational language by no means determined the choice uniquely. In retrospect, based largely on insights drawn from working with IRCS students a decade and more later, I now see that Aravind and Steve's choice to explore the application of monadic logic pointed to a rather deeper feature of discourse structure, separate from, though connected to, issues of decidability. This is brought out by invoking an at the time much less well understood feature of monadic logic, namely its connection with finite variable logics. Such logics were introduced by Leon Henkin in 1967, and understanding the particular form and intention of Steve and Aravind's approach to discourse representation can be advanced from this perspective. And I think here, this is very much in line with what Julia said earlier. It's taken me, I suppose, about 3 decades to actually absorb the import of the kinds of questions Aravind was proposing. And this, as I'll say more about in a bit, it was only because of the education I received from various students I would never have met without Arvind's intercession. So good. Okay. So in typical formulations of first-order logic, one pays little attention to the number of variables that are used in formulating a given condition. For example, one might say that someone has a grandchild by writing, and now this is the extent of my audiovisual capacity. So there you go. Okay, my slide. Yes, this is my slide. So there we go. We have something to look at now. So we could say someone has a grandchild. There is an X, there is a Y, there is a Z. X is the parent of Y, and Y is the parent of Z, right? We could say that. And note that this sentence uses 3 variables. That's easy to see. 3 variables, right? One for each generation, as it were, right? And then we can ask the question, can we express the same condition with only 2 variables, right? Okay. And a little thought reveals that we can, right? So there we go. Okay. So we can say there is an X and a Y. X is the parent of Y, and then there's an X, and Y is the parent of X, right? So it might not look all that familiar, or maybe it does. But the idea is here grandma, right, gives up her claim to the variable X and allows her grandchild to use it, right? That's what's going on there. You see, there she is, and then she passes the variable to her grandchild, right? Okay. Now, arguably, there is some cost in readability, but as we've become keenly aware, in many spheres, sacrifices will be needed to preserve resources for future generations. Okay, so, good. So here, reuse of the variable X forces us to give up the tidiness of pre-next normal form. Some logicians, at any rate, for some reason prize this. But in any case, but we keep our consumption of a valuable resource, the number of distinct variables in use, to a minimum, right? A little reflection should suffice to see that if grandparents are willing to thus relinquish their claims through the generations, we can express the existence of great-grandparents, et cetera, with only 2 variables. Of course, the depth of nesting of our quantifiers becomes arbitrarily large, but still only 2 variables suffice. Now, you might ask, variables seem a rather odd resource to conserve. How do they relate to anything that might be of more immediate interest and, of course, have anything whatsoever to do with discourse, right? Okay. So here we come to an interesting notion of locality. So this is where, now we get technical, not very, anyway. Okay. An interesting notion of locality, right, that arises in connection with a game-theoretic analysis of the logical equivalence of interpretations. We can imagine exploring the similarity between 2 family trees, or directed graphs of any sort for that matter, by playing a comparison game between them called the Ehrenfeucht-Frisset game. Right? Is that a good pronunciation? Frisset again. There we go. Frisset. Maybe the first time I got it right. Anyway, okay. 2 players called spoiler and duplicator, for reasons that will become apparent, alternately mark the nodes of the 2 graphs with pebbles. The spoiler playing first onto the graph of his choice, and the duplicator following by placing the matching pebble on the other graph. At the end of any given round, the duplicator is awarded a win of the game through that round, just in case the map from one graph to the other determined by the matched pebble pairs is an isomorphism between the pebbled subgraphs. Now here's the thing. If we limit the number of pebble pairs that can be played through the course of the game to, for example, 2, by requiring that duplicator and spoiler replay pebbles already used, just as grandma gives her variable over to her granddaughter, or grandson for that matter, then the duplicator has a winning strategy for an end-round game, just in case the graphs are indistinguishable by sentences which use just 2 variables and are of quantifier depth at most n. Or in other words, logical equivalence of the 2 graphs with respect to the two variable first-order logic can be determined by examining graphs of very locally, 2 nodes at a time. Okay? So that's the notion of locality that I think is relevant. And as I say, alas, in 1979, didn't occur to me. But in any case, right? Okay. Now, of course, in the case of a directed graph or in any structure with relations of valency greater than 1, very little discrimination can be had by examining locales of size 1, right? But in the case of monadic structures, that is, structures involving only monadic predicates, such highly local testing suffices to determine equivalence. Or to put it in syntactic terms, every sentence of pure monadic first-order logic is equivalent to a sentence in the one-variable fragment. It is this feature of monadic logic as a discourse representation language that is, I believe, most central to the concerns of Aravind and Steve in the role of entity-centered sentence representation in natural language inferencing. The idea is that highly local information about the discourse structure should suffice for essential inferences that discourse participants fluently execute. And this locality is in turn understood via representation of the discourse itself in essentially monadic terms. Okay. So at the time Aravind introduced me to this research program, I was quite excited to join in, but as I said, I had nothing like the understanding of the matter just portrayed. What I've tried to do is reflect my current appreciation of Aravind's insight into the importance of a particular notion of locality of discourse structure in connection with developing a computational theory of inference in discourse, and the subtlety of the particular formal representation vehicle he chose as a preliminary tool. Needless to say, there remained a great deal of investigation to determine what the scope and limits of this notion of locality would be as a basic element in an explanatory theory of discourse structure, not to mention the work required to effect in detail the, let us dub it, monadization of utterances in discourse. It was a great source of intellectual stimulation to pursue these lines of investigation, first in sole collaboration with Aravind and later in conjunction with our next speaker, Barbara Gross. I will leave it to Barbara a description of the directions these investigations took, because I would like to talk about some other ways in which Aravind transformed my life. Before I met Aravind, I had never collaborated with anyone on an intellectual project. Indeed, if someone had asked me whether this would be likely in the course of my life, I would have said no. Seriously. Research in logic and philosophy at the time was a lone and at times, many times, lonely affair. Since I met Aravind, virtually all my work has been collaborative. I am enormously grateful to Aravind for his role in bringing about this transformation. A part of it, of course, had to do with our collaboration on the investigation of discourse itself. But another very significant part had to do with Arvind's drawing me into the activities of the newly emerging Penn's Cognitive Science Group and welcoming me as a colleague into the Department of Computer and Information Science. Just at the time our collaboration began, Aravind was involved in bringing together a community of colleagues at Penn who shared interests in the study of cognition. And when I say shared interests, I learned early on that it was part of Aravind's genius to recognize when colleagues shared interests well before they might recognize this themselves. The remarkable growth and activity of Penn's initiative in cognitive science owes a gigantic debt to Arvind's vision of an open and wide-ranging collaboration of researchers across several disciplines. And my education in cognitive science in particular owed a great deal to Arvind's active encouragement to become involved in various activities of the group. In addition to participating in seminar series, I began to work closely with several students, many of them here today, which opened my eyes to the possibilities of research at the borders of computer science, linguistics, logic, philosophy, and psychology. Aravind fostered this spirit of, we might say, cognitive science without borders, which created an incredibly vital research community of which I and many others have been the beneficiary. To this point, I have been celebrating Aravind as friend, collaborator, and colleague, and I want to conclude by celebrating him as scientist, and this from a distinctly philosophical perspective. Famously, Eugene Wigner has asked about the unusual effectiveness of math in the natural sciences. And many others have followed, inquiring after the unusual effectiveness of this, that, or the other thing in a given area, like the unusual effectiveness of logic in computer science, right? And so I would like to pose the question of the unusual effectiveness of formal language theory in linguistics. And reflecting on this question has helped me understand some aspects of what I think is the genius of Arvind's scientific contribution. The first is his recognition that there is no evident reason a priori why formal language theory should be thus effective. I think this insight is born of his great creative power as a mathematician. Here, free inventiveness of the human imagination reigns supreme, and it is entirely obscure why any of its inventions should apply in a given realm, for it is rather certain that not all of them do. The second is his freedom from intellectual prejudice, an openness to entertain alternative approaches to a problem that may fly in the face of prevailing opinion. This is a trait that both Gödel and Einstein regarded as central to their scientific achievement. Needless to say, this only has maximal effect when conjoined with the power to create hitherto unexplored theoretical alternatives. In Arvind's case, this is evident in his creation of formal grammatical frameworks that factored the recursive and local aspects of language in an entirely novel way. The third is a deep appreciation of the subtle interplay between mathematical invention and scientific explanation. Arvind's work calls to my mind the Kantian dictum, reason must approach nature with the view, indeed, of receiving information from it, not, however, in the character of a pupil who listens to all that his master chooses to tell him, but in that of a judge who compels the witness to reply to those questions which he himself thinks fit to propose. I submit that it is in part these qualities that have made Arvind's work an especially compelling instance of the unusual effectiveness of the theory of formal grammar in linguistics. So thank you, Aravind, for all you have given me as friend, collaborator, and colleague, and for the inspiring example you offer of reason's power to illuminate the nature of cognition. So, thank you.